you. Yes, I'm glad Father Seamus isn't here because I've known him since I was like 14. So, like, just don't remember anything from that time period, please. Um, but yes, I've been working for the diocese. Let's see, I think 17 years now. They recruited me from undergrad to study canon law, so I've been with them my entire career. And when people ask me what I do, it's whatever the bishop tells me to. So it's really, I used to do mostly marriage cases, but we have far less cases than we used to when I started. So I've started doing a lot of other things, dealing with all the other sacraments. And I also deal with any disputes that come up in parishes, especially between maybe priests and the bishop. I deal with those. And the really fun one, I do deliverance ministry. So people calling, looking for an exorcism, I'm the person you have to talk to first, which is a lot of fun to explain at parties when people say, what do you do? Sometimes I just say, I do legal work for a large nonprofit, and hope they leave it at that. And my husband is actually a blues and rock guitarist. So whenever we do anything social with each other, the one group just doesn't know, like, you do what now? And so we're a lot of fun at parties. But we live in Saco, and we actually have 7 kids, ranging from, my oldest is 13 and just taller than me now. And my youngest actually doesn't have a birthday this year because she was born on Leap Day last year. So she'll be 1 at the end of the month at some point. We'll figure it out. But the bulk of my work has always been with marriage, and I really deal with it on kind of all ends. I help people who are coming from out of state or leaving our diocese to get married in another diocese. I do all that paperwork. So if you know anyone who's a Catholic who's married out of the state in the past 17 years, I've been through their paperwork. And then we help, we try to do marriage enrichment work in the diocese. I wish we did more of that. And then the sadder part, I do what people call annulments, declarations of nullity. That's a big part of my work. And we view it as a healing ministry in the church, but it's really a legal process. So that's where I work with the other members of the tribunal. But yeah, I do a lot of other random things, anything dealing with canon law, which I brought just in case if we get bored at the end of this and don't have enough to talk about, I can just start reading from this if anyone wants. But we're here to talk about marriage. And marriage is really a tricky sacrament to discuss. I really would prefer almost any of the others, I think, because they're much more straightforward. Marriage can be quite complex. It's unique from the other sacraments in some notable ways. One of them is the ministers. It's the only sacrament where a priest, unless he's Eastern Rite or a very unique circumstances, cannot be a minister of. It's the two parties, the bride and the groom, are the ministers of marriage. We'll talk about that more, but it's really unique in all the other sacraments. Usually it's a priest, deacon, or bishop who is the minister, unless there's an extreme emergency. But with marriage, it's the two spouses who make the sacrament. So that's a very unique thing. It's also, we always discuss it as a sacrament, but it can exist apart from being a sacrament, which is unique. So in order to be a sacrament, marriage has to be between 2 baptized people, not necessarily 2 baptized Catholics, but have to have a valid baptism. So what happens when a Catholic marries a non-baptized person? Well, presuming they do what they're supposed to do, it still can be a valid marriage, but it's not a sacrament. So that's kind of a tricky thing because some Catholics may be validly married and not have a sacramental marriage. So it's really you can't have someone who's baptized or receives communion or any of the other sacraments where it's in another circumstances not a sacrament. So very unique and a little bit more difficult to talk about because we usually discuss it as a sacrament, but it's really broader than that because we believe it's also a very natural institution. It's not just an ecclesiastical one, where all the other sacraments are much more ecclesiastical. There's no kind of natural baptism or natural ordination, but marriage, you can have a natural marriage. that is kind of apart from the church, but still very much a valid marriage. So very unique. And our understanding of it has evolved. We haven't changed any of our teaching or doctrine, but our understanding of marriage has definitely evolved over time. And it's interesting, whenever I teach on marriage, I'm always tempted to give as readings. You'll see the selection I sent you. I'm always tempted to also give out Pope Leo XIII's document on marriage, which is called Arcanum, because it's so beautiful. The only problem is it was written in 1880, so some of the language and the understanding would just take a lot longer to unpack, and we only have a couple of hours here tonight. But I'd encourage you maybe after tonight to go and look at that. You can find it, it's free on the Vatican website. If you look under Leo XIII, that's Arcanum. So it's a really beautiful teaching. It does talk a lot about obedience and things, so if you I think if you're reading it and don't have good background on what marriage is, it can be easy to misinterpret. But now that you'll have some background, I think you'll really appreciate its beauty. In fact, anytime Father Seamus asks me to give a talk on marriage, I say I'm just going to read that to them word for word, because you kind of can't improve on that. All right, so when we're talking about what marriage is, since I'm a canonist, I like to go to the code to give the definition, because I think it's actually a very beautiful definition. It comes from Canon 1055, the very first canon on marriage. And that's the matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. For this reason, a valid matrimonial contract cannot exist between the baptized without it being, by that fact, a sacrament. So that's the essential definition. And then I'll read just a little more. I promise I won't do too much canon law. But the essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility, which in Christian marriage obtain a special firmness by reason of the sacrament. The consent of the parties, legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law, makes marriage. No human power is able to supply this consent. Matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which a man and a woman mutually give and accept each other through an irrevocable covenant in order to establish marriage. Now, when you go to some of the documents I gave you in the reading, the Catechism and the Compendium, you'll see that a lot of their definitions, it comes from this. They're all very much in coherence with each other. The law, we focus on certain things because we're looking at what is a marriage, what makes a marriage. And you'll see anytime we're looking at both who can get married in law and who can't, this is what we're looking at, and this is why we're making the decisions we make. And that's where, like, you may have heard of the word impediments. An impediment is something that would prevent a marriage. And there's a number of them. Some we say are divine law. So for example, one people are actually surprised by, but is impotence. So two people coming to get married have to be capable of consummation, of fulfilling that. And when you take canon law, they give you very, very detailed definitions of that, which I will spare you. But it's very technical, and this has to happen and this has to happen. But you have to be capable of that. Now, people can choose not to, but that capability has to be there. So now with our population, we're the oldest state in the nation now. We get quite a few people at a very advanced age who want to get married. One of the awkward questions we ask everyone, but especially people who may be very advanced, is, are you capable of this? And sometimes the answer is no, we're just, we want this companionship. Well, that's not what marriage is. It's more than companionship. It's more than friendship. And that component you can't take out from marriage because it's essential to what marriage is. So even if it's not, we know that people who, two 90-year-olds, the chance of them having a child together are very, very low, unless we've got a Sarah and Abraham situation going on. It's funny, whenever we grant dispensations, so if a Catholic wants to marry a non-Catholic, they have to sign a promise and declaration that they'll do everything in their power to persevere in the faith and to raise any possible children in the Catholic faith. And we always get people saying, well, I'm past childbearing age, why do I have to do this? And it's because that's what marriage is ordered to. And even if it's not probably possible, first of all, you never know, miracles happen, and it's about what it's ordered to. So that's something people are often quite taken aback by. And then there are certain ecclesiastical impediments we put in place. Age is one. We set, an age, there's a natural age. People have to have reached puberty. But then we can also set a higher age for marriage because we know that cultural circumstances, in this country, legally, an 18-year-old in most states, including our own, as of last year, you can't legally marry in the state of Maine if you're under 18. You used to be able to get parents' permission and a judge, but they've done away with that. So if you're under 18, you can't get married. And as the church, we generally respect civil laws as long as they're not contrary to our teachings. So we also have said if you're under 18, we won't allow you to get married. Now that's not a natural law thing because a 17-year-old may be quite capable of marriage, but it's a recognition of our state laws as well, and just in our culture it would be less common for someone under 18 to have the maturity necessary for this very serious commitment. So some of the impediments are set by the church. Another, obviously, ordained priests, Latin Rite, cannot marry once they're ordained. So that's an impediment to marriage. Holy orders. If a priest wants to get married, he has to have permission. He has to have been, we usually use the term laicization, and have to be dispensed from his obligation to celibacy. That's not a natural law one, that's ecclesiastical. So we've got both going on. Now that you've had that kind of general definition, I'll jump in a little bit with what I gave you from the compendium, because I think it explains it very nicely. So what is the plan of God regarding man and woman? So this is where we look at ultimately the Trinity. Who is God? God is love, and it's a relational love. The Father, Son, Holy Spirit, it's a relationship. And God is love and created man and woman for love and has called them to love. So by creating man and woman, we're called them to this intimate communion of life and love in marriage. So we look at the Gospels so that they are no longer two but one flesh. And then, obviously if you've studied scriptures, there's a lot in Genesis going back in the Old Testament about marriage. Be fruitful and multiply. We do this through marriage. For what ends has God instituted matrimony? So this is where we have it in that definition. There's those two. We've got the communion and good of the couple. So that's where the law says, it's ordered to the good of the spouses. In canon law, we talk about that in Latin. We call it the bonum conjugum. So it's the good of the spouses, has always been essential. They both have to want what's best for each other. So in canon law, that's also why one of the grounds, if someone is petitioning for a declaration of nullity, is the exclusion of the bonum conjugum. So if someone marries without that intention, that can in fact be an invalid marriage. Now this is pretty extreme. Some people will say, well, he wasn't very nice to me. That's not necessarily exclusion. The example we got in school was, think of if it's a mafia situation where someone is marrying another just to inflict pain and damage on the other's family, that there's no love and care for them. It's quite the opposite. That would be a case of exclusion. So that's pretty rare, but you do see it in time. Cases of someone who is extremely abusive. They're not able to have the person's good and well-being as their concern, and in fact treat them beneath the dignity that a spouse deserves. That can be an exclusion of the good of the spouses. So that's what we talk about. And then, of course, the procreation and education of children has always been essential. And an interesting thing is, so this code I'm reading from is the 1983 code, which is the current one in force. It's changed a lot during this pontificate. You keep having to update these codes we get because Pope Francis likes to change the law a little bit here and there. But before this one, we had the 1917 code, which was in force until this one. And in that code, when they listed those essential properties, they listed procreation and education of children first. And in the present code, they've flipped them. It doesn't mean that we've changed the order of them at all, but I think it was done to really emphasize that the good of the spouse is equally as important as the procreation and education of children, because in the past there was much more of an emphasis on the procreation and education of children. So it really didn't change anything. They just really wanted to say these are equal. There's not really one greater than the other. So they tried, so who knows what they'll do in the next code. They may flip them again or list them differently. But they've always been, since the church defined marriage and started writing about these have always been considered essential to marriage from the earliest time of church teaching. All right. So looking at the history, the question in the compendium, what does the Old Testament teach about marriage? So God helped his people, above all, through the teaching of the law and the prophet, to deepen progressively their understanding of unity and indissolubility of marriage. The nuptial covenant of God with Israel prepared for and prefigured the new covenant established by Jesus Christ, the Son of God, with his spouse, the church. So it's always been understood in scriptures that these teachings the church has are difficult. They're very hard to live out because you're dealing with two different people in this covenant. So we've kind of developed over, until we get to the time of Christ, these concepts of unity and indissolubility. You hear about that, the famous passage from Matthew about divorce, which is a very harsh teaching, and people, divorce has been allowed in the time of Moses. And Jesus just says, that was really done for you at the time, but now that I'm here, we're raising marriage, and we're really kind of making it what it always should have been, which is indissoluble. So that's always been, and I'll talk more about that a little later, since that's such an essential teaching too, and I think one of the most difficult ones to talk about, especially if you've ever helped out at an RCIA. Now it's OCIA. I think I have another month until you have to say OCIA, so I'm in that grace period. But that's always one of the harder teachings to teach people who did not have a Catholic background, and even Catholics really struggle with that concept, indissolubility. Why should I be bound to a marriage that only lasted a year when I was 20? I'm not the same person. I don't understand. Doesn't God forgive all? It's a very hard teaching to teach people. But that is, it really comes from the New Testament. It comes from Christ himself. So it's an important part of our teaching. So then what new element did Christ give to matrimony? Raised it to the dignity of a sacrament, as long as you have two baptized people. And that really gives the spouses a special grace to live out their marriage as a symbol of Christ's love between the bride, the church, and Christ. That's where you've got the beautiful teaching in Ephesians, husband, love your wives as Christ loves the church. So people, when you talk about how difficult marriage can be, you say, well, why does the church still have this expectation? How do they expect people to live it out? It's grace. The grace from the marriage and the grace we receive from the other sacraments. That's how we're able to live out this very difficult thing in a hopefully beautiful way. All right. Are all obliged to get married? No, definitely not. Marriage is not for everyone. We're all called to love, and we're all called to relationships, but some people are called to different vocations. Some people are called, to celibacy through either religious life, through ordination, holy orders. There's a lot of different forms of consecrated life in the church. I have a few friends that I work with who are consecrated virgins. So they're not nuns, they don't live in community, but they've been consecrated by a bishop as virgins to live in this perpetual state. They never marry, but they serve the church through this very unique vocation. We've got hermits, we've got a few in this diocese who live a life of mostly solitude and prayer, and that's how they live out their vocation. Our new chancellor, if you've had a chance to meet him, Brother Jim, I actually knew him back, we were in law school at the same time, so I've known him forever. He is a brother, but not a priest. So he's a Franciscan, but he has not taken holy orders. If you ask him why, he'll tell you, I like my weekends free. Fair enough, I understand. But he also lives a celibate life. He never can marry, and he serves the church in a very particular way. He's a Franciscan, so he lives their charism and according to the order, but he's not a priest and he's not married. It's a unique form. So there's a lot of different ways people can be called to live out their vocation in the church. Not all are called to marriage. And that's a question we get very often, one of the harder ones today, which we'll talk about, but with marriage being ordered toward procreation and education of children, that means when you get married, you have to be open to having children. So it is not an option for a Catholic getting married to say, I have decided I'm never having children. That's an impediment. You cannot get married if you have that. So some people will say, well, I feel very strongly that I'm not called to have children. And the answer is, then you are not called to marriage. You may be called to a different kind of relationship, but it's not the specific one of marriage, because you cannot separate that, what marriage is ordered to, from marriage. So if you want a marriage that is free from even that possibility, what you want is not marriage. It's a completely different kind of relationship. And that's another one that's very hard, because in our society today, that's seen as such a personal choice that's not the way the church looks at it. It's not a personal choice. If your vocation is to marriage, it is all of what marriage is. You can't pick and choose what you want yourself. It's not an individual thing. That's also something people don't understand, is marriage is a public institution. We all have different states of life, whether you're lay or cleric, married or single. That's a public thing about you. It's not a private thing. So marriage is not a private institution. That's one of the reasons we celebrate it, canonical form. So when a Catholic gets married, unless it's an emergency or in danger of death or something, you have to get married in a church before at least 2 witnesses, and you have to have an official witness for the church asking for and receiving your consent. Normally that's a priest or deacon, or bishop, of course. In extreme cases, there's no priest around. During COVID, actually, was an interesting time, because if you were in a place where they said we're not doing marriages at all, the rule in canon law is if more than 3 months, you have a right to marry. So if you were a Catholic in a place where they were saying you can't get married in the church for at least 5 months or whatever, and you'd already been well prepared for marriage, you could contract a civil marriage and kind of let your church know, and it would be what we call an extraordinary form of marriage. So in a time when you can't observe canonical form, when you're not able to. Less common, we used to, before COVID, say, oh, this is like plague times, it never happens. And then COVID happened and we all said, okay, here we go, we've got another example. And it's interesting, in this diocese, we did give some exceptional things, like we allowed for marriages to take place outside as long as they were on church property. We actually did the same with funerals too. And we looked at, back in our history, when the Spanish flu struck, that's also what we did. So we kind of took some of the same things we did from then. But the thought was, because it wasn't considered safe for people to gather in the large group in the church, we had in Maine some laws about whatever size it was. I think my family, we couldn't even have dinner together because we were too big. So, but people were actually free to contract marriage outside of the church because of that. Because the church says it's such a natural right to marry, you need a really strong cause to have these rules about it. So that kind of leads into, how is the sacrament of marriage celebrated? So the church does prescribe certain rules about how we celebrate marriage. And it's interesting because this has not always been the case. It's actually relatively recent. The church, it used to be very long ago, people could marry really any way they wanted to, and the church considered that a valid marriage. They always encouraged, since really the first, second centuries, we encouraged people to get married in the church with their community before the sacrament, with a priest there, but they didn't have to. One of the big problems they had, especially in the Middle Ages, was something we called clandestine weddings. So these were secret weddings when just the bride and groom would exchange consent to marry. Now the problem was, what happened a lot of times was someone would, usually the man, say, I marry you, great, we're married. Then bride becomes pregnant, man runs away and says, we were never married. And she has no way of proving they were married. There are no witnesses, nothing is recorded, so she's on her own. And this actually became a big social problem in the church. So the church said, what are we going to do? We're going to outlaw these clandestine weddings, and we're going to prescribe forms so that we can know that the marriage was really celebrated, and it was celebrated correctly between free people who were able to. So the church now says, you've got to have, like I said, so that's one of the trick questions in Catholic trivia. How many people do you need present for a valid wedding? The answer is 5. You need the bride, the groom, 2 witnesses, and the official witness, who's usually the priest or deacon. So that's how many people you need. And normally in a church, I said, unless for some reason it's unavailable, and they have to publicly exchange that consent. We normally follow the rite of matrimony, which I included for you. I won't go through all that, you're spared, but you can take a look at it. It's really quite beautiful. One thing people are surprised by is you do not need a mass to have a valid wedding. 2 Catholics often do have a mass, and that's a beautiful thing, but it is not required for a valid sacrament. It's its own thing. Very similar to baptism. We often have baptisms in Mass, but you don't have to. I usually baptize my kids outside of Mass because there's so many of them. It can be really disruptive. If we have all of them kind of front and center, it can turn into a circus pretty quickly. So we like to have it kind of privately on Sunday afternoon or whenever it is. So you don't need that to be valid. And in fact, if you're marrying a non-baptized person, you can't have a Mass. People are also surprised by that because it's not a sacrament. So you're not celebrating a sacrament. It's not really proper for it to take place during a Mass. If it's a mixed marriage, a Catholic and a validly baptized non-Catholic, you can have a Mass, but it's a judgment call, because if you have at least half of the congregation non-Catholic, having communion, that can be really tricky to have to tell over half the people you can't be receiving communion. That can cause kind of an awkward, difficult time and some strife. So it might actually be a better, more pastoral option to have it outside of Mass. All right. But there are possibilities that, especially when it's a mixed marriage, to get a dispensation from that form. Because even though that form is what the church wants, I said that's not an essential part. It's essential that there's 2 witnesses, an official witness, and all this, but having everything else, something we want, but it doesn't make the marriage itself. So for example, if a Catholic is marrying a Jew, probably neither one of them wants to get married at each other's house of worship. So we might grant a dispensation and they get married at a neutral location, keep both families happy, still have a valid wedding, though non-sacramental. So those are some possibilities. So I said that the form of marriage is not what makes marriage. What does make marriage? The answer is resoundingly clear throughout all of church history. It's consent. It's also something that's really drilled into you when you study canon law. We're all about consent. So much so that some of my priest classmates redid the Beatles' All You Need Is Love to All You Need Is Consent, because it's so essential. And as I read in that definition, no human power can supply it. So there is nothing we can do. If the 2 people are not willing to get married, there is nothing the church can do to make that a marriage. So that's why the church generally does not have arranged marriages. They may be valid, but we want it to be very, very clear that both people are consenting to marriage. That's also why if you've gotten married in the church, you might recall being questioned privately by the priest who was officiating your wedding. The reason they do that is to see that you're free to marry. And often it might be the other person who's pressuring you to marry, so we insist that this is taken individually and by a priest, so there's some confidence there. So you're questioned about, are you free to marry? Is anyone pressuring you? Is anyone forcing you? Is this really what you want? We really drill that in our priests when you're working with couples. You have to be clear that it's really that consent. And that can be a difficult thing. People aren't always honest. That's why special care is prescribed in cases, for example, if someone's pregnant and getting married. There's often a lot of pressure. It's often a difficult situation, not something they expected usually. So it can be very difficult to make a clear, willing, active consent in those circumstances. The term shotgun wedding, it's very real. And I have seen many cases where an actual shotgun was involved in these cases. So it's not something we just talk about. It still happens in today's day and age with an alarming number that I'm still very surprised by. So it's not always something, if people aren't telling us the truth, we can't really do anything, but it is something we always ask and try very hard to ascertain. You also may remember banns of marriage. They're no longer required and becoming less common, but I don't know if this parish still does them at all. Some parishes, especially smaller ones in small towns, will publish bans, right, usually in the bulletin, where they'll say, this couple is planning to get married, sometimes give a date. The reason we used to do that used to be required, was to make sure both people were free to marry. So someone couldn't say, well, she's actually my ex-wife, and she's not free to marry, or those two were actually first cousins. They're not free to marry unless they have a dispensation. And there's certain requirements you have to meet to get that one. So there's all these things that we want people to be able to tell us if they're aware of any reason. The old in movies, is there any reason these two should not be married? We don't ask that anymore, and Catholics usually didn't, because that's what the bans took care of. And today, that's what the premarital investigation takes place, so that we can make sure there's no reason that we may not know about why these two can't get married. All right, so it's all about consent, that the two people really want to get married. There's no force. That's also why there can't be deceit. That's another ground for you. You can't trick people into marrying you. You can't lie about something that's very important. Now, it can get a little dicey if you're talking about, everyone is kind of on their best behavior when they're dating. And then sometimes when we get married, I had no idea she was really a brunette. So, that's not going to be grounds for an annulment. But major things, he told me he was a chef at a restaurant, and it turns out he is not a chef and he's actually a career gambler. That might be grounds, because that's not who you thought you were marrying, or presenting a fake identity. That happens too. I didn't even know his real name. Another one, which surprisingly common, people having another family at another place. Maybe there wasn't a marriage, but he has 3 kids and a golden retriever in Virginia that you didn't know about. That's something really important to know about. So we say a quality that would, by its nature, disrupt what we call conjugal life, the life of the marriage. You have to know those things about each other. That's why one of the questions on the premarital investigation is there anything important about yourself that you have not shared, that the other person might want to know about? So there's a lot of things. Sometimes people have maybe a disease that the other person doesn't know about that would put them at risk. Things like that are all important. So you can't trick someone into marrying you. They need to know who they're marrying. All right, and then I talked about what's required if a Catholic wants to marry a non-Catholic. You have to have that dispensation. So if you're marrying someone who is not Catholic, you need that dispensation for validity. So if you don't get that dispensation and you go ahead and marry someone who's not Catholic, that is not a valid marriage. You have to have that dispensation. For a baptized Catholic, you need it for what we call lyceity. That just means kind of all the boxes are checked, you did everything right. So my husband, when we got married, was actually a baptized Methodist. He got better, don't worry. It took him a little while, but he is now a Catholic. So when we got married, we had to get permission for mixed marriage. It was a little awkward because we had to get it from my colleague and friend. So a little bit strange, but you do what you need to do. So that's needed for lyceity. And as I said, what you do is you stress to the Catholic, this can be a danger to your faith. Are you prepared to persevere in your faith? And have you discussed how you're going to live out your faith when the other person does not share it? That can be a very difficult thing, especially when children come along. And that's why we also make them promise you're going to do everything in your power to raise any kid as a Catholic. So if a couple comes to us and says, well, I'm Catholic and he's Jewish, we want to get married, we want it to be valid, but we're going to raise the kids Jewish. We won't let them get married in the church because that's one of the ends of marriage. So if you're not intending that, it's not really a true marriage. That's, again, the procreation and education of children. Part of the education is raising them Catholic. So if you're intending not to do that, that's a problem. All right. What are the effects of marriage? So marriage establishes that perpetual and exclusive bond between the spouses. And we believe when it's the sacrament, we've got two baptized, God himself seals the consent of the spouses. Now, when the couple is married, when do they become married? At the moment they exchange consent. So when they say their vows and say, I do, they are married. But the marriage, we say, is ratified and consummated when the marriage is actually consummated. So that's when it can never be dissolved. So interestingly, this is another fun Catholic trivia, if the marriage has not been consummated, it can be dissolved. So we still to this day occasionally get cases where people will petition for a declaration of nullity, claiming that the marriage was never consummated. And we have to do some investigation into that, see is this really possible? Like I had a case where it was, I think, Vietnam era. They got married and later that afternoon he deployed. They were never actually alone together. They literally went from the church to saying goodbye and then, kind of got a Dear John letter and never actually came together as spouses. So even though that marriage, they exchanged consent, they observed canonical form, because it was never consummated, it could still be dissolved. But when it's between two baptized people and it's been consummated, it cannot be dissolved. Now I said baptized people, so what happens if it's between baptized and non-baptized? That can be dissolved under some circumstances as well. We've got two cases, and I'm going to forget all the different criteria, but we call it a privilege of the faith, and this comes right from the scriptures. So you can go and see it, but basically, so a Pauline privilege, let me see if I can get this I might not get them all right, but it's when you have a non-baptized person generally married to another non-baptized person. They marry, and then they get divorced. And one of the non-baptized people then wants to get baptized, wants to become Catholic and marry a Catholic. In that circumstances, we believe it is better for them to be baptized and marry the Catholic, so privilege of the faith, because this is a non-sacramental wedding. They're not living together. There's no hope of reconciliation. The Pope himself can dissolve that marriage. There are certain criteria too, like the person can't be, they say, the predominant cause of the end of the marriage, and the person they want to marry cannot have caused the demise of the first marriage. So if the non-baptized had an affair with a Catholic in that marriage, then wanted to marry them, you can't have the privilege there. So there are certain circumstances. And then the Petrine one, so the Pauline one, we can actually grant, the bishop can grant that. When I said the Pope, he can do that too. The bishop can actually grant that one. The Petrine privilege, Peter has to go to the Pope. So that is when That's a little bit different. You don't necessarily need a conversion there, but it's a non-sacramental wedding where someone wants to marry a Catholic. So it's a favor of the faith of the Catholic party. But the same kind of criteria apply. The difference is because it's not two non-baptized with a convert marrying a Catholic, that's a very clear case. With the other one, we have to look a little bit more, so those ones go to Rome. Surprisingly, those used to take forever. Now they generally take about 4 to 6 months. So people, when you hear they have to go to Rome, people panic, but we say, no, 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 it's pretty quick. We can email them these days. So it's very different than even when I started. All right, so that's indissoluble, when it becomes indissoluble. It's when it's, for a sacramental marriage, it becomes indissoluble when it's ratified, observing all that form, and consummated. But you don't have the same kind of strength and firmness in a non-sacramental wedding. All right. Then we talk about in the Catechism which sins are gravely opposed to the sacrament of matrimony. All sins are opposed to marriage, but in particular adultery and polygamy. We talk about because those go against that unity and exclusivity. So those are very big problems in a marriage. Other major sins include, we say, the deliberate refusal of one's procreative potential, refusing to have children. So someone might get married, say, I'm open to have kids. Once they get married, no, I refuse. That's gravely sinful. So all those things, because again, the ends of marriage, we've got that good of the spouse, which includes fidelity, and that procreation and education of children. All right, another tricky question. When does the church allow the physical separation of spouses? So not divorce, but just separation. So the church does permit separation in serious cases when living together is practically impossible. The standard we use is intolerable, even though there may be hope for reconciliation. Now, when this happens, the parties are not free to contract a new marriage. Now, it's very, very rare, and in today's day and age almost never used, there is an ecclesiastical separation of the spouses. So when a couple petitions a bishop and says, do we have cause to separate? In most cases, when people actually separate, life has become so impossible, they are able to make that decision for themselves. They don't need a bishop telling them, your life is impossible. So notably, those are in cases of abuse, both physical and emotional, when it's really endangering someone's emotional and physical safety, and repeated infidelity. Those are the major ones. There can be other ones too, but those are the most common ones we see. So people may have cause where it's not at all sinful, and it might even, especially in the case of children, be the moral choice. If you've got children, you have a duty to protect them and safeguard them. If you're living in a marriage with abuse going on, you need to get them safe. That's part of your duty as a Christian parent. So the church would say you have the right and the obligation to separate in those cases. And people think this is a new thing. It's certainly not. I have a friend where this is his area of expertise, and when he gives presentations, he uses a lot of texts from the ancient church, from the medieval church, showing that this has always been the case. It hasn't always been lived out that way, but it's always been the church teaching. All right? Now, in our society, when people are separated for a long time and there is no hope of reconciliation, it may be that civil divorce is the only means they have for safeguarding things like children with custody, property, all those financial matters. So some people do seek civil divorce. What is the attitude of the church toward people who are divorced? Just being divorced is not itself a sin. It can be, especially if you were the party kind of asking for the divorce, especially, for example, if you were unfaithful and left the marriage to pursue a new relationship. That's obviously an objectively sinful situation. Someone who abandons the marriage for not what we'd say a severe cause, just, I don't feel the spark anymore, so I'm going to leave. That is sinful. But people who leave, I said, for those serious reasons, that is not sinful at all. So someone who is simply divorced, are they able to receive the sacraments? Yes, they are. And in fact, that is encouraged. And someone going through such a difficult time should be going to the church for the support of their community and the grace of the sacraments, especially a party who's been abandoned in a marriage. That's something I think the church needs to work a lot harder at getting that message across, because a lot of divorced people do not feel welcome in church to receive the sacraments or to be with their community. So I think that's something we have to really be telling people. Just because you're divorced doesn't mean that you're exiled from the church or you can't receive the sacrament. And if there is, even in a case where someone was divorced and maybe they did something to cause it, that's a matter, you go to confession. You get absolution, you can receive the sacraments. So we've got that situation. They're not barred from the sacraments because of the divorce. What is a problem is if then they go and contract a civil marriage. Now this would be the same for Catholics who chose not to marry in the church. I'm just going to go to the justice of the peace and get married. That's an objectively sinful situation, and those people should not be receiving the sacraments either. Same as people who are cohabiting. It's an objectively sinful situation. So if you have someone who is divorced and then just civilly remarries, that's problematic. There may be times where the people decide, we really want to receive the sacraments, we want to get right, but for whatever reason we can't divorce. There may be times where then they choose to live as, we say, brother and sister. So they stop all sexual intimacy and live as if they're brother and sister. They may be able to receive the sacraments in some cases. It's really up to the priest. It's not a good situation, because when you're living in close quarters to someone you're attracted to, that's exactly what the church would call, if you took catechism a long time ago, we call it occasion of near sin. You're putting yourself in really temptation all day, every day. Not a good situation for anyone. So it's not ideal, but for example, if people have children together and they really can't separate for the good of the children, they may be called to live as brother and sister. There's actually a priest who has a beautiful story about his parents did that. They were both divorced, remarried, had a kind of reversion back to the faith, and they had children at that point and really couldn't separate because they wanted to raise their children together. So they made the decision to live as brother and sister, were very open with their children, and their children saw this as a beautiful example and sacrifice for the children, which led to this priest vocation. So it's not an easy thing, but it can be done with grace. So that's a little bit about divorce and remarriage. But hopefully, the church wants people to stay married. They have, I said, if you read any document on marriage, it's written in very beautiful terms. Again, if you read that document, Arcanum, it's really described quite beautiful. Another document, if you've read Familiaris Consortio, a bit more modern than Arcanum, we talk about the family as the domestic church, which I think is a really beautiful example of how the Christian family just manifests and lives out the nature of the church. So the love between Christ and the church is shown between the love of the husband and the wife, and they in turn give that love to their children. So we say each family member, in accord with their own rule, exercises the baptismal priesthood and contributes toward making the family a community of grace and prayer, a school of human and Christian virtue, and the place where the faith is first proclaimed to children. So the family has always been held up to be an essential and beautiful part of the church, really the building blocks of the entire church community. And it should be an example to even those who are not called to married life of what the love between God and his church is. That's the ideal of marriage. All right, so I've just thrown a ton at you, and we're at a little under an hour, but are there any questions about all that? Got it all fine? Yes.
It seems that cohabitation is very prevalent today,
Mm-hmm.
and was taking a class at Boston College a couple of years ago, and the priest teaching the course just told the class, and a lot of the people in the class were headed towards ordination. He said, when I sit down with a young couple, I'm actually surprised when they're not living together.
Mm-hmm.
How does the church handle that?
Yeah, that's true. Even I was married a long time ago, 2009, and we did marriage prep here at Cathedral. We were the only couple in the whole group who was not cohabiting. And our sponsor couple actually said, do you guys know what you're doing? Because shouldn't you live together before so you know what living together is like? And yeah, excuse me. Yeah. So it's a reality, all humans are sinful and fallen. So it's not an impediment to marry, but if you're entering in marriage, and you're kind of unrepentant in that state, that's a problem. It's not an impediment, but you're not going to be able to receive that grace as fruitfully and effectively. So really what should happen is, and we tell priests, you should be counseling people, if at all possible, to separate, as soon as they can, or at least, live as brother and sister until the wedding, so they can receive that. And there's always been the tradition, before you marry, you're encouraged to make a total and fruitful confession. So you're entering into marriage in the state of grace. So that's how we deal with it. We really tell people, you want to be in a state of grace so you can effectively receive this. Just like, when we tell kids receiving First Communion, you need to go to confession first. Even if you're 7 and you probably haven't done too much. Although I'm preparing 2 of my daughters for confession, and when we were practicing, we kind of did a practice, and I told them, you don't really have to tell me your sins, and my 6-year-old still wanted to, and I learned a lot. So I don't know, but in general, most kids, it's not that serious, but even to receive communion, you want to be in a state of grace. Exactly with marriage. If you're receiving the sacrament of marriage, you want to be in a state of grace. So people who are cohabiting should be told to stop, if at all possible, and to confess before they approach that sacrament. Yeah. Okay. Any other? Well, I know you just arrived, but we're going to take a little break now. So, yeah, perfect timing. So we can take a little break and then come back and dive in some more. Thanks. Sure, yeah, I'd love so. Thank you. Dive back in. During the break, did any questions come up? Well, feel free to, and especially on this one, feel free to raise your hand and jump in at any point too. Especially if I use any words that you don't understand, just stop me too, because I can do that. I know when I started, canon law can be like its own little language, and when you study it, you don't know what anyone is saying, but then you forget that other people don't know that once you learn it. So sometimes you say things, and even my husband's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but we work at it. But then other times I heard him explaining what a synod of bishops was to someone else, and it's like, how do you remember that? I barely do. So it all works out. So for this second half, I'm going to be looking mostly from the document that you were sent on the propositions on the doctrine of Christian marriage. So there'll be a little bit of repetition with the earlier part, but kind of looking at it through a different lens. So I said, when we talk about marriage, I said it's a very unique thing because it's a sacrament, it's a natural institution, it's a divine institution. It's between the 2 spouses, so it's really unique. So we're going to break some of those things down a little bit. So matrimony as an institution. So it's got 2 dimensions. We've got the human and the divine views of matrimony. So marriage, said we believe it's instituted between the spouses themselves. So that's what I talk about. Marriage is made by consent. There's nothing else that can make marriage. You have to have the 2 parties consenting to marriage. And they have to be consenting to what marriage actually is. not their own ideas about marriage, not what they want marriage to be. So if someone is consenting to a polygamous marriage, we would say that's not a true marriage, because that goes against the nature of marriage is exclusive between two people. We talked about earlier, if people want to consent to a marriage which is not open to children, now that's choosing it. I want to clarify that's not people who can't have children. Very different thing. That's never invalidating. It's when people are actively willing not to have children, that's a problem. Very separate from the tragedy of infertility, which is not what you're willing, it's something that's just there by biology. But we believe that it's that consent which makes it. So that's really the human. And because of that, how marriage is impacted in some way, subject to historical and cultural changes. So they kind of, in different, where you are in your culture, marriage is going to look a little different. And canon law, that's one reason sometimes people will say, well, that law doesn't really make any sense. And say, you have to keep in mind, the law of the church is universal. It's not just for the United States, it's for all countries and all people in the world. So there are some canons very specific on things like kidnapping. Well, in our country, it would be extremely rare for someone to be kidnapped and married. Go to Mexico, there's a tradition called stealing the bride. Now, it's usually done more as a joke, where it's almost like a bachelorette party where people kidnap them and bring them and we have fun. But there are actual cases where what they do is they literally will go and kidnap a young girl, usually a teenager, and force her into the same house or building as the guy who wants to marry her, and force her to spend the night with him. And once they've been in the same house, people assume sexual activity has happened, so both families force them to marry. Now, this is hugely problematic. So there are canons and laws saying this is wrong, this is bad. This still happens today. It's not an old tradition, so that it usually doesn't, but I do cases for a lot of other dioceses too, and dioceses with a lot of Mexican Catholics petitioning for nullity. We see this all the time. It's very, very common. So it's not always talked about, but it happens. So when they said we've got these cultural things, the church has to deal with what is acceptable, where we can say, okay, this is a cultural tradition that we can include, like a positive one. In Mexican tradition, they have certain aspects in the ceremony they like to bring in. Those are good, nice ones, no problem, that's fine. Kidnapping your spouse, we're going to say no to that. So we look at what might be acceptable in a culture and what really goes against the nature of marriage. So that's where it can be a little bit difficult. I said, today we have the phenomenon where civil marriage is just completely different than what church marriage is. So there used to be this presumption that civil marriage looked very similar to church marriage. So if you had two people who married civilly who were non-Catholics, we presume that's a valid marriage, but not in every case anymore. Biggest, kind of most clear example, same-sex marriage. Church believes has to be man and a woman. You have to have that procreative element. That's absolutely essential. You can't take it out. With two people of the same sex, that's necessarily missing. So they can never have a valid marriage. So if people have, if they want to have that marriage examined, which does happen surprisingly, that we wouldn't say that even enjoys, the language we use is the presumption of validity. So the church presumes most marriages are valid unless proven otherwise. But if that's the case, we would not have such a presumption. Same would be if we call it consanguinity, one of my least favorite things to deal with. People who are related together closely. So obviously siblings can't marry each other. So if you have a culture where that's acceptable, the church would still say that does not even enjoy the presumption of validity. We don't presume that's a valid marriage. There was one exception in all of church history where a dispensation was granted for siblings to marry. They were royals. It was very political, Middle Ages. But other than that, I think there might be two actually, but it's almost never happens. So again, that's where cultural influences we're looking at. We kind of take a look at that as the church. And sometimes laws that are sort of just dealing with cultural aspects can change, but what is essential, so then going to the divine view of marriage, those things can never change. So we say, as easily shown in the New Testament, Jesus confirmed this institution of marriage which existed from the very beginning and cured it of its previous defects. So most notably, indissolubility. So in the past, Old Testament times, divorce was possible. This is never what God intended, and Christ restored that. So with so many things, restoring it to its dignity and the original requirements. He sanctified the state of life, made it holy, by including in it the mystery of love, so uniting him, he's the Redeemer, to the church. That's really what marriage is. It's about helping the spouses become holy in this state of life. So Christ raised it to a sacrament and conferred grace to help us live that out. Recognizing, again, in the Old Testament we had divorce because it's such a difficult thing to live out, but the thought is with Christ conferring grace in the sacrament, that helps us, so divorce should not be allowed at that point anymore. All right. Then going through marriage in the epistles of the New Testament, you look at how they talk about marriage, and we'll see it's really exalted, even though that wasn't really true in the rest of society and the rest of their culture. This was a uniquely Christian aspect, that we're exalting marriage. Marriage should be honored in every way, and in response to certain attacks, they present it as a good work of the Creator. Especially exalted among the faithful. We really want Catholics to be marrying other Catholics or converting the ones that they marry. That's really part of the mystery of the covenant and the love of Christ and the church. Now it is interesting, even if you go back to church history, there is this idea, when you look at the spouses, there's this idea, of course, the man is the head. He is the head of the family, and of course the Ephesians passage we all know about wives submitting. But then you have this equality where husbands are called to love their wives. And even in these old documents, as I mentioned, my one from 1880, they talk about the dignity, and they clearly say, yes, the man is the head, but the wife is not a servant. She is never to be that place. They are, they're helpmates and they're working together. So there's still this idea of, the man is head, the wife obeys, but it's similar to obedience in religious life and ordained, where you obey your superior because you know they love you and want what's best, and you're called to have this love of Christ for them. So very different than what it looked like in the rest of society at that time, even from that first century. That's why even from the earliest time, we want marriage to be contracted, they say, in the Lord. That's where we get canonical form from. We really want it to be part of our church life. And we want it to be in accordance with the dignity of us post the risen Christ. So there's a lot of warnings in the New Testament about being on guard against pagan habits, that we have to look as marriage as this permanent thing open to children. We have to have our own unique Christian form of marriage, and we have to help each other to live it out. There's this aspect of community. We're to support each other, to support marriages. Now, during the first centuries of church history, when we look at what did marriage look like, it looked pretty much like the rest of society. Even though you could get married in the church by a priest or bishop, it was more normal that the father of the family would preside, and you'd only have certain rites and gestures. Like a common one was uniting the hands. Many cultures have that. Like if you've seen the Scottish tying of the knot, it was very similar to that in the first century Christians. But they still had these, they call it the extraordinary and truly paradoxical laws of the spiritual society. So one of the things they did was make sure that when Christians got married, it didn't look like a pagan wedding. You'll see that in a lot of New Testament is focused on separating Christians from pagans. I actually talk about that. I said in the other class I taught here earlier, talking about the problem of evil, I talk a lot about exorcism, and you see that a lot in the New Testament. And one thing that they really tried hard was to make sure Christian exorcisms did not look pagan, did not look magical or superstitious, that they were really the authority of Christ. And the same is very much true in marriage. Maybe it's weird that I'm drawing parallels between exorcism and marriage, but that's the church we live in. And we really wanted to say this is a different thing from a pagan marriage. It's a higher thing, it's exalted, it's a sacrament when we've got two baptized people. It's about making each other holy. So we don't want it to look like any pagan ceremony. We also stressed the importance of procreation and education of children. This is the foundation of the church. We want to, how do we spread the gospel most effectively? To our own family, to our own children. It's often the most difficult that way, as most people will tell you, but that's really where we're called to spread the faith most directly, is within our own families. They showed in matrimony a special submission to God and a relationship with the faith. So that's when we see really it becoming more common that we want marriage celebrated in a Mass along with the celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice, and we want the couple to receive a special blessing. So much so that, in our church, so if you go to a Catholic wedding, there's a very beautiful blessing at the end. Now in the Eastern Rite, so our Catholics, so these are your Byzantines, your Antiochs, all these different rites. They're still Catholics, but a different rite. I think there's 22 churches like that. The blessing in the Eastern Rite is so important that it's actually more constitutive. You need it. You can't get married without it. And that's actually why in the Eastern Rite, only priests can officiate weddings. Deacons cannot. So anytime I'm looking through marriage paperwork and I see that we've got an Eastern Rite Catholic, or if I even suspect it based on the last name, I make sure to tell them, make sure the priest does this one and not a deacon, because if a deacon does it, it's not valid. So you need the priest. So that blessing has always been very important. Even though with Catholics, with Latin Rite, it's not that essential, it's still a very important part of the ceremony. And that's why when people ask, one of the most common questions I get is, can I get married outside? I want an outdoor wedding. If it's two Catholics, the answer is no, unless it's COVID and we can't go in the church. But the answer is no, and why is that? We want you to have the Eucharist there for your wedding. You're getting, this is a sacrament, and even if it's not, it's something good and holy, we want the grace there. We want you to do this in front of the Eucharist. What better way to start a new part of life? Yes, God is everywhere, but it's not the same, the trees in the ocean, it's not the same as Christ and the real presence. That's a different thing. So if you're a Catholic, I don't want you to tell me that you want to get married outside and you don't want Jesus there. That's a problem. So if anyone asks you why Catholics can't get married outside, that's the reason. All right. So then looking at, going through won't go through all of church history tonight, I promise. But I said we do see from the very ancient times, the Eastern churches, that's what I talked about. The shepherds of the church themselves, the bishops, often took a very active role in the celebration of the marriage. And this was similar to having the fathers there, as in, before we had the church. So bishops were much more important then. And as time passed, it became much more the priests, because it was impossible for bishops to officiate every wedding. In the Western churches, the problem of what element constituted marriage from a legal standpoint became much more of an issue with marriage and Roman law. So that's canon law is based largely on Roman law. This was resolved by considering that the consent of the spouses is really the only constitutive element. So if you remember one thing from tonight, I hope it's that consent makes marriage. The consent of the two people, that's what makes marriage. All the other things we talk about, in extraordinary times, they can be dispensed. So if a priest, is walking around and he comes on a car accident, there's two people in it, one of them is dying and they say, Father, we're engaged, we're both Catholic, I don't think he's going to make it, will you marry me? He can marry them right then and there, and that's a valid wedding. danger of death, kind of everything goes out the window. But what do you need? You need the consent of those parties. So if he loses consciousness, they can't get married. He needs to be conscious and know what he's consenting to. That's essential. All these other things, witnesses, church, those are not constitutive. You need them under most circumstances for valid, but when it kind of comes down to it, what makes marriage that you can never change, it's the consent of the parties. All right. Okay, so moving up a little bit, when we've got, I said, the Council of Trent, this is when we really started defining marriage a bit more concretely. The Council of Trent, if you've studied church history, this was really a pivotal moment. This is happening right after the heels of the Reformation. So the church is trying to, we got to get it straight, what we believe in, what we don't. We're defining things very clearly. So that's where a lot of what we believe in our doctrine and our catechism really comes from this. So I mentioned earlier in the first half that concept of clandestine weddings. So that was the secret marriages where there's no witnesses, the parties just consent and hope for the best. If you've ever read, Pope Francis always recommended the novel, what is it in English? It's The Betrothed. It's a beautiful novel by Manzini, I think, and the premise is it's kind of love in the time of the plague. What better setting for a romantic story? But it's a young couple who is desperately trying to get married, and because of all kinds of family strife, no one will officiate their wedding. And during that time, you didn't really need this whole ceremony. You just needed a priest to hear you consent to each other. So they were literally running around in the plague with people dying and the Inquisition and all this, trying to shout, "I consent," in front of a priest. So it's actually, despite the plague, it's quite a funny story. And I actually highly recommend it. It's really good. But that was a big thing the church was dealing with, this problem of clandestine weddings. How do people get married? What is essential? What's not essential? So they came up with this idea that you need to have consent. That's constitutive. They also still said clandestine weddings are still valid. So again, you don't have that really change in the whole universal church until 1907. Bless you. There was a decree called Temetsi that made the canonical form of marriage, 2 witnesses, a priest, in a church, universal and required for all, was not until 1907, which is pretty amazing. In most places, they had some decrees about you have to do this and that, but not everyone knew about it. It wasn't universal. So it wasn't until that time that became universal. So pretty recent in church history. And sometimes the question comes up, could the church change canonical form? Yes, they could. And in fact, some have called for, because so many people are marrying outside of form, some have called for eliminating canonical form, saying people should just be able to marry however they want. You can still get married in the church, but you don't have to, and that's a valid marriage. That has not happened yet, but it's a possibility. So as of now, it's canonical form still required universally in the whole world. But that did not take place until 1907. So, we're only at not even 120 years that's been around, which in all of church history is a pretty tiny slice of time. At Trent, they still said the blessing of the priest, his presence as a witness in church, and some rites were strongly encouraged. So this is where you start to see the rite of marriage, which I included. This is obviously an updated form. We just updated it again pretty recently. But that's where that all came. So it wasn't until 1907 that all the elements we think of today as being common, that people think have been on, since the beginning of the church, they're all pretty new. All right. So then jumping ahead a bunch of centuries, all the way to Vatican II. So this is where the new rite for celebrating matrimony came about, and we're really developing a lot of new liturgical and juridical norms. So we have the Code of Canon Law we've had since 1917, but this 1983 code was a result of Vatican II, but it took a long time to get there. So we've got Vatican II is really changing a lot of people's thoughts on marriage, and they're really trying to harmonize the reality, what Christian marriage is, what it always has been, with some new understanding of marriage. So also recognizing that in the church we have so many different cultures, and we have to kind of be respectful of these cultures while still making sure that this is a legitimate. So this is where customs that go contrary to church teaching we're not going to allow, but certain ones that are fine and fit within our traditions, those are great. One of the things that was really kind of came about from that is the understanding of that good of the spouse, that marriage is a total gift of self. So prior to this, there was really much more of a kind of bare bones. We focus very much on procreation and education. So if someone was trying to get a declaration of nullity prior to this time, it was very much, are you sane? Are you capable of consummation? Did you will to have children? And if those are all met, you're not getting a declaration. Or some of the others, are you related to each other, and so forth. But really, other than that, it's very hard to. But with Vatican II, there is this understanding that, marriage, because we exalt it, it requires more than just that real basic sanity. You have to have sufficient maturity. You have to know what marriage is, at least a basic understanding. Certain things like severe personality disorders might not be compatible with marriage if they're not managed properly. So these are all newer understandings of them. And that really affected canon law. So some of the canons in the code, in the 1983 codes, are new. Some of them are rooted in the old. It's funny, one of the questions that comes up in canon law are, what do you do if you have a marriage celebrated before 1983? Well, we have to follow the process in the 83 code because it's going on today, but that marriage was bound to the laws of the 1917 code. So some of them might be different unless it's something that we consider natural law. So those things, again, you have to, will the good of the spouse, you have to be sane, you have to have a certain amount of maturity and so forth. Those things are considered natural law. Certain ecclesiastical laws, one thing they changed was prior to the 83 code, if a Catholic was marrying a baptized non-Catholic, you had to get a dispensation for validity. They changed that in the 83 code, so it was just laicity. So that meant that if you didn't get a dispensation, it was still valid. It was just, you shouldn't have done that. But you didn't need that dispensation. You still do if someone is not baptized. But if it's just a Protestant and the priest forgets the dispensation, then that would still be a valid marriage. But if a priest forgets to get a dispensation and it's a non-baptized, that would be invalid. We actually have a remedy for that, though, especially if it was a priest's error, which unfortunately does happen from time to time. He can request something called in English, we call it a radical sanation. It comes from the Latin radicatio sanatio, which means healing from the root. So in a sanation, a bishop has the authority to heal what was missing to make the marriage valid from the root. So it's actually retroactive. So if a priest forgot to get a dispensation from, we call it disparity of cult, so baptized, non-baptized, the marriage is invalid. Then he calls me on Monday and says, Shannon, I forgot to get a dispensation. What do I do? I say, fill out this petition, Father, and we look at everything. Okay, he forgot to get this. Did they really consent to marriage? Do we think there's any risk they're going to abandon each other right now? We grant the sanation. This is when even though I have the power to, I always have a priest do it because I just feel better about it. But the priest grants it. Yes, and well, you can, I am authorized I'm delegated by the bishop to grant dispensations. There's a little bit of debate about that. It's pretty much settled, but there's still people who prefer a priest because you're exercising the bishop's power. But I'm very clear when I grant it, I'm exercising this by delegation of Bishop Ruggieri, not on any power of my own. But with sanation, since it's a little more, you're actually making a marriage valid, that's when I go to a guy with a collar. But we can do that. And even sometimes, I had a case once where a guy was married shortly after Vatican II, and they decided to get married in a Protestant church. And he said, well, I knew from Vatican II that was okay. I said, yes, but you needed to get a dispensation. And he legitimately hadn't understood that. And he thought he was contracting a valid marriage. His intention was to validly marry, but because of this kind of ignorance of the law, it was invalid. So we were able to grant a sanation for that 40 years later, healed it at the root, and made a 40-year marriage valid. So it's a really beautiful, powerful thing. And the reason we can do that is because his consent was true. He really consented to marriage. He just did it wrong. So that's a case. If people are not really consenting to marriage, we can't grant a sanation in that case. So we have to have those elements. But it's I think, a really kind of beautiful thing that even a lot of priests don't know we can do. So it's a neat thing that sometimes even many years later, people will come and say, I didn't realize. The most common one is priests forget to get delegation. So priests can only officiate at marriages in their own parish. If they go to another parish, they have to get delegation from the pastor to officiate. Now, delegation can be verbal, it can be written. It should be written, because if it's not in writing, you can't prove it, but it can be verbal. So if, Father Seamus here goes home to, the Lewiston area and wants to do a wedding for someone, a friend in Lewiston, and forgets to go to Father Dan and get delegation, that marriage is invalid, even if the couple did nothing at all wrong. So now he would never do that. But if he called me on Monday and said, Shannon, I'm so sorry, I forgot to get delegation. It was my home parish, Father Dan's my friend. So then we would do a sanation. And in that case, we wouldn't even tell the couple about it, because they did nothing wrong. We don't want to worry them about thinking, oh no, my wedding night was invalid, I committed a grave sin. They didn't. They did everything, trying to do the right thing. So the technical term some canonists use for that is the fixie-poo, where we fix a priest's mistake. But the church does recognize we're a human institution, humans make mistakes, we have to have a way to fix it. So, and as long as, again, you've got that consent, that's possible. That's what we're really looking at. All right. Okay, so some of the changes that we see. I said, so starting at Vatican II, the understanding of marriage, we see it being much more personalistic. And one way you can tell that is some of the language we use. I don't know if you noticed when I read that definition from the code, the word contract comes up a lot. Now, the church does view marriage as a contract, but also not just a contract, it's also a covenant. It's both things. Now, the language prior to Vatican II focused much more on that contract. So you've got people making this consent, they're exchanging rights and duties. Certain ones, we've said children is a big one, fidelity is one, permanence is the other. Those are really the three, and the good of the spouse. So those are the things they're exchanging, those rights and those obligations. And we talk about in the church as that way. So for example, with children, that's always the trickiest one. So dive right in with that. But the parties, both of them have the right to request children at any time. You can never tell someone you don't have the right to request it. Doesn't always mean you have to fulfill that, but there's always that right. It's not legitimate to say we've made an agreement to never request children. There may be circumstances where it's not prudent to have children. I haven't encountered them yet, but it's going to happen someday, I know. But for most people, there may be times in their marriage where that's the prudent, responsible choice. But people always have that right, and it's not legitimate for one party to say, you don't have the right. It's only my right to decide when we'll have children. It's not ever a unilateral. Both spouses have that. Same with fidelity. No one has a right to say, I can be unfaithful. I think that's the more clear example. But both parties have the right to that. And that's why when that's been breached repeatedly, a spouse might have the right to separation when that right is not being fulfilled continuously. But since then, in one of the documents, Vatican II documents, I mentioned Familiaris Consortio. Another one that talks very much about marriage is Gaudium et Spes. So that really talks about marriage in a beautiful way and use the language of an intimate partnership of life and conjugal love. So we saw some of this language in the canon as well. It's a lifelong partnership for the whole of life. And it's really where, the fundamental thing is we want to improve the welfare of the other person in marriage. We want this marriage to be good for them, to help them, to make their life better. So that needs to be there, that intention. And Gaudium et Spes also clarified that, we've got marriages for the common good, but we can't ever kind of sacrifice an individual for the common good in marriage, because the common good is the sum of, they say, these conditions of social life that allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So we've got marriage, this understanding that it's an intimate community, it's an intimate, between two people, and a partnership rather than just a contract in very legal terms. It's a much more kind of whole, expanded view of marriage. All right. And then they also look at very much the sacramentality of marriage. That's discussed very much. So one of the differences at Vatican II, prior to it was pretty much presumed that for the most part Catholics were marrying other Catholics. It was much more exceptional to marry a non-Catholic. But when we had Vatican II, there was a recognition that this isn't the case as much as it used to be, so we really need to talk about sacramentality of marriage. So we see that it said in the Gospels, and even going back to Genesis, Christ disclosed in this prophetic way that the reality of marriage has always been intended by God from the beginning. But it was restored through Christ in his death and resurrection. That's why Christian marriage is lived, we say, in the Lord, and also determined by elements of the saving action of Christ. So we see this kind of prefaced and foreshadowed in the Old Testament. That's where there's a lot of talk about the covenant between God and the people. We see this with Israel, and then in the New Testament, Christian marriage has this new dignity where it's represented as this mystery of love between Christ and the church. And if you think about it, that's about, as high as you can get. So for humans to raise a very human institution to that level, that was a huge difference and a change from the Old Testament, which is again where indissolubility comes in and why that's even possible. It's because Christ raised marriage so highly. And we also, over the centuries and through our tradition, it's not, I said, expanded or changed, but we say it's illuminated more profoundly, that the supreme love and gift of the Lord who shed his blood for the faithful and the irrevocable attachment of his spouse, the church, they really became the models and examples for Christian matrimony. A lot of it's about sacrificing yourself for the other person. And this resemblance that it's a relationship of real sharing in the covenant of love between Christ and the church. From its own standpoint, Christian marriage, it's always been the symbol and sacramental sign of the church for others and for the spouses themselves. But it's also really said very much for the rest of us. And again, this is why marriage is not a private institution. It's public, it's part of the community. We want the married couple to be showing others what the love of Christ is like. When you see how much a couple loves each other, you should understand how Christ loves the church. That's really the ideal. And that's why we call it the domestic church. Right? And then sacrament in a real sense. So when we talk about marriage kind of taking on the likeness of a mystery, that includes Christian marriage in this, they call it the economy of salvation. And that's how we kind of justify the title of sacrament. What is a sacrament? A little kid, I said, I'm preparing a couple of my kids for their sacraments. If you ask them what a sacrament is, they'll sigh and roll their eyes and say, It's a visible sign of invisible grace. But that is really what it is. As humans, we need these tangible, real things to know these mysterious things that we can't really grasp on our own. And marriage in that way is something we really can't comprehend as humans, the love Christ has for the church. But we can see what it's like. And marriage is a way that we can see what that love is like. And that's what it's supposed to be about. And it follows from this that Christian marriage itself is this real and true sign of salvation, which confers the grace of God. That's why it's one of the 7 sacraments. And that's also why I said it's unique that it's between the spouses themselves. It's not, when people say, oh, the priest married me, all he did was witness the marriage. You married your spouse. The priest didn't marry you. He was just, asking for and receiving your consent, but you married each other. You're the ones who made that sacrament. And when we talk about the sacramentality, that's really connected to that indissolubility. And again, I said this is something in our OCIA we have to really hash out, that this is why marriage is a sacrament. It's something kind of greater than just what plain old civil marriage is. That's why it's indissoluble. It's a relationship, it's reciprocal, and it makes our grasp of that sacramental reality more clear. And when you think about it, when you're consenting to marriage, there's so much you don't know. You have no idea how that person's going to change. You don't know what life's going to hit you with. You don't know how it's going to work out. But as a Catholic, you're consenting to that person for all time, for until your death, not beyond that. But that's a pretty incredible thing if you think about it, that no matter what happens, you're consenting to that. And that's what, when I do marriage prep, I always tell the couples, imagine you live in a society with no civil divorce. It's not possible to get a divorce. So no matter what, you have to stay married to this person your whole life. Well, guess what? You're in that society today. It's called the Catholic Church. I said there may be certain circumstances where that's exceptional, but you have to go into marriage intending that permanence and indissolubility. That no matter what happens, this bond, if this is a true, said especially if it's a sacrament, if it's consummated, no human power can dissolve that. That's permanent. So that's why it gets to that level of sacrament. And that's why we have grace to help us along, because most of us can't do it on our own. We really need that. And just like other sacraments, we say marriage confers grace, and the term they use, in the final analysis by virtue of the action performed by Christ, and not only through the faith of the one receiving it. So even if people are kind of unsure about church teaching on this, and they're not really 100%, that doesn't matter, because it's Christ who raised it to a sacrament, not the people. Now that doesn't mean that if people are really kind of opposed to church teaching, or they're not living in accord to church teaching at all, that grace is going to be effective for them. We hope it will be, but you have to be open to that and willing that too. So you want to be, we say, disposed for the grace. So that's where we have the question, and today it's very common. You might have people who come to the church to get married, but they're really doing it because their family wants it. They're not really that invested, but the church is pretty and grandma really wants this, and we've always gotten married here. Do they have a sacrament? It depends. If it's between two baptized, it is. Whether that grace is effective to them is a different question. Similar to baptism. When you're baptized, that changes your soul forever. So it doesn't matter what you do after that, that baptism has an effect. Now, that doesn't mean, if you kind of turn away and have a terrible life and never repent, that your baptism was enough. No, but baptism changes you and has certain effects which can't change. All of our Christian life and becoming a Catholic, it comes from baptism. It's really essential. When I studied canon law, the first kind of big book of the code is all what we call general norms. And there's quite a few of them. When I studied I think the second part of it, my professor got caught on Canon 96. And we spent almost the entire semester on Canon 96 and then just blitzed through the rest of the book. I don't recommend that, but I'll read it to you. Canon 96 is, by baptism, one is incorporated into the Church of Christ and is constituted a person in it with the duties and rights which are proper to Christians in keeping with their condition, insofar as they are in ecclesiastical communion and unless a legitimately issued sanction stands in the way. So everything about being a Christian comes from baptism. That's where all the effects, all the rights and obligations. Now, you want to be fully initiated, you need those other sacraments, First Communion, reconciliation, confirmation. But what makes you a Christian, what makes you a Catholic is baptism. Indeed, one of my absolute proudest moments today as a mother, which I always tell this story, and my daughter is so sick of it, but when she received her confirmation, it was Bishop Dealey at the time, and he likes to quiz the kids a little bit to see if they're prepared. And he asked a question about the effects of baptism. And my daughter raised her hand and said, Bishop Dealey, he's a canonist, consult Canon 96. So she listened well, and he just laughed. But it is true that, that's all the effects of baptism. That's where all of our life as a Christian come from. The other sacraments are important, but baptism is really first. And that's when we talk about marriage, that baptism is really what makes it a sacrament, the two people's baptism. One of the coolest things, and one of my favorite things to tell people in RCIA, if you have a non-sacramental marriage, so a Catholic marries a non-baptized person, the non-baptized person decides to become baptized. When they become baptized, at the moment of their baptism, their marriage becomes a sacrament. So it's really just, it's like a beautiful, amazing thing that I think we kind of need to talk about more, because it's really incredible. But they not only get the grace of their baptism, their confirmation, they also get the graces of their marriage. So it's an incredibly powerful, efficacious thing. It's kind of like a super sacrament at that point. And they don't have to do anything to the marriage, presuming it's a valid marriage, of course. That baptism itself confects the sacrament of marriage on those parties. So it's a really amazing thing and kind of a testament to the power of baptism. All right, and I got all off track there, but let's see. So then the question is, what do you do if you have people who are baptized but they don't believe? Maybe they were not catechized, they fell away from the faith. So this is really a pastoral dilemma that we're dealing with constantly in the church today. Especially, they say our state of Maine has become the most secular state in the nation. I think we looked at our new stats. This is really troubling. Only 1% of babies born in Maine this year were baptized. 1%. That's all faiths, not just Catholic. So it's really a tragedy that we need to get better at. But it's something in the church we're dealing with, both the non-baptized and then the baptized non-believers who don't believe and then are not baptizing their own children. So when we prepare people for marriage, we really need to impress on them that good of the children involves raising them in the faith. So when you come to the church and you want marriage, that means you want to be open to children that you will raise Catholic. So I think we really need to do some work in educating people on that and helping them do that so that we can get more babies baptized. But now, what do we need? If you've got people, I said, coming to the church who don't really believe and are kind of there half-heartedly, what do we have to have for that to be a valid wedding? They really need to have a minimum intention of carrying out what Christ and the church desire for marriage at the minimum. Now, this is pretty basic, and we actually in canon law we say that most reasonable people of a certain age and maturity would intend this for marriage regardless of their belief or background. So I said those are the basic, that they intend it to be permanent. Now, some people will certainly say, well, I understand divorce is a reality and maybe I don't have a problem, but most people who get married on that day are not thinking, I'm going to just get divorced in a few years. That does happen, surprisingly, but most people are thinking, I hope this works out, I want to be with this person forever. That's a natural part of marriage. Less so today than in the past, but still most people intend to be open to having some children. So not always, that one's getting a little dicier, and most people intend to be faithful. Not always, again, there's many exceptions unfortunately, but those are kind of the basics, and they intend the well-being of the other. They genuinely love the other person and want this marriage to be a good thing for them. So that's the minimum people need to be intending to have a valid marriage. If any one of those is missing, that's not a valid marriage. So we'd consider that if they have that true consent, this is a free thing, they're not being forced or pressure, they know basically who they're marrying and they're intending those things, that's a true marriage. The question of, is it a sacrament? It is by the nature of their baptism, even if they're not wholly open to that grace yet. And a beautiful thing is sometimes people who maybe weren't open to it as much when they get married, down the road they may become more open to it, especially when they have children, when times get tough, they may look to the church and learn about their faith, their marriage, realize they have this gift open and available to them, and they can turn to that. So that's again where the church, we need to be supportive of married couples and help them know about this gift of grace that they have available to them. All right. So that's that sense. It doesn't necessarily depend on people's faith, but you have to have certain minimum intentions to it. And how effective that grace is, depends on the individual. All right. And that is why when we have couples coming to the church, one of the reasons we require a period of preparation, we don't want people to rush. So in our diocese and most others, we require that a couple be engaged at least 6 months before their marriage. Can be exceptions. It's not a hard and fast rule. Sometimes it was, I actually had a friend who they'd been dating for years, and I think one was moving to a job, and he planned on we'd get married before and then we'll move together. Had no idea that weddings took a long time to plan, so just wasn't proposing yet, and then proposed and they realized, oh no, we have 4 months, and had to really rush things. But that wasn't a case where they weren't prepared or weren't ready or their whole relationship was working toward marriage, so they were allowed to marry. Also helped that the groom's dad was a deacon, but so not something I'd recommend trying. Don't try this at home, but there can be exceptions, and we have granted. But in general, we want to make sure the couple knows each other and is prepared, and that takes some time. So in our diocese, we say at least 6 months is the time, and that's encouraged. I think if you've heard recently, Pope Francis has called for, I think he called it a catechumenate of preparation for marriage, saying we should approach marriage more like we approach baptism, that we really have a longer, more thorough preparation, because church marriage is so different than civil marriage. People often aren't witnessing Christian marriage in their daily lives, so they need more preparation to prepare for that. All right. Okay. So then moving on to the concept, I said this is again from that creation and redemption. So since all things were created in Christ, through Christ, and in view of Christ, marriage is truly this institution of the Creator, becomes, as I said, that figure of mystery between Christ, the groom, with the church, the bride, and in a certain way it's directed toward that mystery. So marriage celebrated between those two, that's why it's been elevated, and it really signifies that the love of Christ in the church is a spousal love. It's a sacrificial love. And there's lots of examples of that throughout Scripture. And you can't separate that. That's what I said when you're talking even of non-believers. You can't have marriage between two baptized without it being a sacrament. That's one reason we have the form. Because if two Catholics decide, I'll just go to the justice of the peace because I want marriage but I don't want a sacrament, that's impossible. What they're contracting is not a marriage. maybe a civil contract, a civil form of marriage, but it's not a true marriage in the church. So that's why you just can't take those apart. Anything that's constitutive to marriage, you can't separate from it. All right. But as I said, we still think that marriage between non-Christians is legitimate. So one of the thornier parts of my job is having to explain to a non-Catholic why they might need to petition for a declaration of nullity. So in this case, you've got a Catholic wants to marry a non-Catholic who is divorced. They are not free to marry. Even though they're not Catholic and they weren't married in the church, we still believe that non-Catholics can validly marry. And if you think about it, it would be pretty crazy if we said the only ones in the world who can validly marry are Catholics. That would be really disrespectful and crazy to everyone else in the world, and kind of go against many of our principles. We believe marriage is a natural institution. All people who are able can enter it. So we can't say that only Catholics can validly marry. So that means that a marriage between two non-Christians, presuming it meets certain basic criteria, we presume that's a valid marriage, which means, like any other marriage, we believe that's lifelong. So we don't believe divorce can sever the bond of that marriage, even if it was merely civil, so they can be free to marry. So in order for them to be free to marry a Catholic, the only way they could do it is if that marriage was found to be null. Now, sometimes it's a little easier because when you have a non-Catholic, it's more likely that they're missing one of those constitutive things. Maybe they weren't open to children, maybe it was an open marriage and they weren't planning to be faithful to each other. Maybe it was one of these starter marriages. Or we have cases, we call them simulation, when people get married and it's not really to be married, it's for some other cause. So the most, I think, easy example is a green card marriage. Someone marries you not because I want to be your spouse, but I want to help you become a citizen. Helping them become a citizen is not what marriage is. So if that's really their only intention, if that was part of it, they also intended to really be married, that's fine. But if it was really, as soon as you get citizenship, I'm going to take off because this isn't a real marriage, we would call that simulation. They're simulating marriage. But in most cases, I said, we just presume that is a valid marriage. So that's why a non-Catholic might have to petition a Catholic tribunal for a declaration of nullity so they can be free to marry a Catholic. Right? Does that make sense, or are you all still very confused? So I know that I said that's a really difficult one to explain to people. But I think when you tell them, like, we respect that, when you married, you meant what you said. Most people, even if it's at, a drive-through chapel in Vegas, most people use traditional vows, till death do us part. We believe when they said that, they meant what they said. So we don't believe that the divorce was effective in just dissolving them promising to love someone their whole life. So that's why we have this process. All right. Okay. All right, indissolubility, we've talked about a lot. This is a really tough one. There's a lot of questions about it. People bring up a lot of different things from the Gospels, and depending on what part you read, it can be confusing. I think the clearest passage explaining indissolubility is the famous, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Some people bring up that, doesn't the Gospels allow for divorce in the case of adultery? No, we don't believe that. Now, it is, I said, it may be cause for separation, especially continuous, unrepentant infidelity, but that doesn't itself dissolve the bond of marriage. It can be, if that was the intention from the beginning, that would be grounds for a declaration of nullity. You have to have that intention to be faithful. But it's a very different thing. Most people, when they enter marriage, intend to be faithful, and then they fall later after the wedding. That's a different thing. If the intention was there from the beginning, which does sometimes happen and people are surprised from, but it's fairly common that in today's day and age, people will be unfaithful and fully intend to continue that infidelity once they marry. again, an alarmingly high number of cases I read. And it is a very common, it's quite rare that I read a case even if grounds aren't anything to do with infidelity. That's in, I'd say, about 85% of cases there is infidelity somewhere along the lines there. So it's very common, but in itself, it does not dissolve the bond. It's only if that intention to be faithful was missing from the beginning. So those are different things. But again, the church's teaching on indissolubility is very much linked in our belief of sacramentality. What is a sacrament? And when you look at marriage as a sacrament, I think it makes a lot more sense to look at marriage as being indissoluble. Now, I will clarify, because this is another question that comes up, it is till death do you part and not beyond. So that's the question of, can a widow get remarried? Yes. Some of you may say, of course they can, but surprisingly, sometimes people will submit a petition for declaration of nullity when their spouse is deceased. And we say, you don't need this, it's to death and not beyond. So we don't believe that the bond of marriage continues past death. It's a human thing. So that's the question, and again, coming from the gospel, does marriage exist in heaven? No, it does not. Does that mean you won't be united with a spouse in heaven? No, not at all. That's not what it's saying, but it's that humans don't have the same, we're not the same as humans on earth as we are in heaven. Marriage doesn't exist in the same way in heaven. So that's why marriage is only for life and not in death. All right, let's see. But again, indissolubility is really, I think, an essential element to marriage, because if you take that out of marriage, I think it really weakens marriage overall. If marriage is something that we could just dissolve, when we need to, when it's convenient for these things, it wouldn't matter, and that commitment you make wouldn't be nearly as deep and meaningful. Very much like the Eucharist. You have this famous Flannery O'Connor quote, when people were arguing that, the Eucharist was just a symbol. And she said, well, if it's just a symbol, then to hell with it. Same with indissolubility. If you take that apart from marriage, to hell with it. It doesn't have any meaning. If you're just consenting, until it gets difficult and we decide to go our separate ways, that's not much of a marriage. It doesn't have the same commitment, meaning, and not that need for grace that a sacrament does. With indissolubility, we have the need for grace because it is so difficult. We need to rely on Christ. It really forces us to rely on Christ. So that's part of, it's really intertwined with sacramentality. All right. Okay. Any questions so far with all that? So we're coming to the end of time. Yeah, do you have one? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And choosing a spouse and dating. And I was just curious what insights you might have on that for people of that discernment in marriage and kind of educating and bringing it out to children. Because I hear it a lot from people who maybe their children have fallen away from the church and have also gotten married to someone who maybe has not held to their faith.
Yes.
And that type of thing. So I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. And I could teach an entire course on that, because I think it's something, I think this generation doesn't know how to date at all. And I'm actually friends, if you read The Pillar, which is a Catholic media source, I went to school with J.D. Flynn, so that's, if you know, and I'm friends with his business partner. But he's been talking a lot about this lately, that I think when they go to events, people tell them, I really want to get married, but I can't meet anyone. And if I do, I can't date them. And I think that's a huge thing, especially with social media and so forth. Like, people don't know how to have a conversation face to face anymore, and they don't know how to date. So even with Catholics, it tends to either be the hookup culture, where they're just looking for sex and there's no relationship, or Catholics these days tend to really agonize over even going to a first date because they think it's committing to marriage. So you have that with a lot of devout Catholics, where from like the first coffee date, they feel like they're engaged and committed, which is, both extremes are very, very dangerous. And so I think we need to be talking to people about how to meet people, how to date, how to reject others gracefully, how to accept rejection gracefully, and know kind of appropriate boundaries, because I think it's a very dangerous thing. Like, we talk about emotional chastity, not giving your whole self away to someone right away, and learning how to, build that and grow. Because, you see people where, I think that's the cohabitation thing we talk about, where people just go from occasionally hooking up or going on dates to, we're going to live together, and they're sharing their entire lives together. That's a huge mistake and just so detrimental for marriage, because intimacy has to build naturally. And when you go from either having no intimacy or having this extreme amount of it, both are very, very dangerous. So I think people have to learn how to go on dates again. I think a lot of men don't know how to ask a girl out anymore. It's maybe we'll be friends and see if something develops. They don't know how to ask her out. And girls tend to, once you're asked out, it's, do I want to marry this guy? Well, no, you don't need to marry him. You just need to have a cup of coffee with him. And learning and teaching them how to do that, and teaching them red flags to look out for. So I think it's important early on to have the non-negotiable discussion. It's funny, when I met my husband, he actually proposed to me the first day we met, and I was on a date with another guy, so it was a little bit surprising. So don't play poker with him. He goes all in. But he did it. It was obviously more of a joke, and he was doing it to get my attention, and it was successful 7 kids later. So, but he was always very clear, and that's something I really appreciated, because when I was kind of coming of age, there was this whole thing about, you have to have this foundation of friendship before you go out, and you have to. I completely disagree with that. Marriage is not friendship. It's a very different thing. And I think it's really nice. And with my husband, it was, hey, I'm attracted to you. I'd like to get to know you better. Would you like to go out with me? And to me, that was so refreshing, because all the Catholic guys I dated, it was like, we have to build this friendship, and then maybe we'll go on a date, but we don't know if we're dating yet, and it takes forever. Where I said with my husband, it was, I like you. And he actually told me, he was like, I've got plenty of friends, and I'm not looking for another one. And I was, okay, he was very clear. But then when I met, I was like, have you ever dated a Catholic? He's like, oh, well, my dad was married to a Catholic once, and said, kind of, don't listen to them. They're not really like that. I was like, well, you're in for a surprise. Here are some ground rules. I'm not going to live with you. I'm not, like, all these things. If we have kids, they're going to be Catholic, and we will have kids. And just, had that non-negotiable. But then our relationship, we didn't spend every day together. We went on dates, and I think that's healthy. It builds. And I think that's good for people. Be clear about your intentions, but don't, just go out with people. Get to know people. Don't be afraid to cut it off when it's not working. You see that so much, especially with cohabitation. It's much, much harder to break up with someone who you're living with. And a lot of times people there's expectations. Oh, they're living together. They're going to get married eventually. They're committed. So it builds this false intimacy, this false sense of commitment, and there's no real commitment there. So it's so unhealthy. And but I think with young people especially, I said, just teaching them how to have a meaningful conversation is so important. In today's day and age, screening them, teaching your kids what to look out for. One thing I always tell my kids, like some non-negotiable, any violence, relationship is over when you're dating. No questions, do not pass go, it's over. Same with infidelity, which shouldn't be kind of going on anyway, but if there's any infidelity before, it's over. And then, looking out for big problems, one of the biggest things we see in marriage is addiction. State of Maine, that's a huge issue. So many of the marriages I see, drugs, alcohol, various forms of addiction. So really screening for that and realizing that most problems will get worse and not better after marriage. Many people go into marriage thinking, well, he's drinking a lot, but once we get married, he'll settle down. Once we have kids, he'll really straighten out. It's usually the opposite. Sometimes with God's grace, it does improve, but that's the exception, not the rule. Narcissism is a huge, huge one we're seeing now. I wish every marriage prep would have like a narcissist screening tool where you could see that, because that's just poisonous to marriage. So those are really the big, teaching people to screen for those and really teaching people their dignity and respect. I think in marriage, huge thing, teaching fathers to love their kids, especially with girls. Like my husband jokes with our kids, especially Valentine's Day and things, like he gets them flowers, he gets them chocolates, he does this because he doesn't want them to be impressed by some guy who, got the $10 bouquet at Hannaford's. So teaching them what they deserve and their dignity and worth so that they're not swept away. One of the most tragic cases we see is kids from abusive, dysfunctional home. The first person who's kind to them, they can't resist that. And that's a tragedy. And in the church, that's a big thing, teaching people their dignity and worth, because they might not be getting that at home. So the church can be their home to them and teaching them this is how you deserve to be treated. I think that's so important, and it is a wonderful thing. When I started studying canon law, I was very young, and my parents were divorced, and it was not a happy home. And when I showed up to the first day of school, I thought I was in the wrong place. My husband said it was like a punchline of a joke because it was 13 priests and a blonde. And that was my class. But one of the great things was all the priests, for the most part, treated me so well. I'd never had guys like open doors for me and kind of with the manners and all that, and just that basic. And it really taught me I deserve this and I should be treated well. And I had never had that at home. So for me, the church was an experience where I really learned about my worth and dignity, and that I deserve to be treated well, and that I deserve to kind of have my clear boundaries about how I'll be treated. And I think a lot of our young people today just don't have that. So I think the church can be that for people, and we can really impress on them that's what you deserve, and you're a child of God and you deserve to be treated as such. So is that a very long answer?
Yeah. I was going to say, Gary and I do marriage prep, and obviously, one of the things that we're always amazed at is when the kids are going through the class, how individualistic they want to be inside of their marriage.
Yes.
And we are always like, so when do you actually come together? Because it's not going to work if you each stay really individual in everything that you're doing.
Right.
Right? You're bonded.
Yeah.
You really need to have every little bit of your checking account totally separate, and his laundry and her like when do you actually start to be one, because that's what you're looking to do.
Exactly. Yeah. And
I
even
don't know if they're afraid
yeah.
to make those kind of commitments. I'm like, well, you're sleeping together,
right.
You know what I mean? It's
yeah.
just like, where's the line?
Yeah.
It's hard for them. I think it's very hard for people.
It is. And I think that comes from
individualistic society.
Yeah.
It's all about me. So.
And that comes from, I think, where they don't have that true intimacy. They just jump to the physical, and they didn't ever build up. It was all disordered, the wrong order. So, but yeah, I definitely see that dynamic, and you see that like extended family is a huge issue. And teaching people, like when one of your family members talks to your spouse disrespectfully, they're talking to you that way. And like you have a duty to, uphold their dignity and not let others treat them poorly. That's on you. It's not on them. Just, when your family is treating them badly, that's on you. So yeah, I 100% agree. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, if any come up, you're always welcome to reach out. So this is what I do for work too. So feel free to, if you ever want to reach out, or if anyone has complicated situations or family members you have questions about, you can call me. I'm the only woman in tribunal, so I'm easy to find. And
We
so.
call Shannon all the time in our office. We're like, we have a problem, call Shannon. We need to figure it out.
Yeah, the communications director is like, so you deal with like all this stuff? I was like, yeah. It's a full service place, but I enjoy it. And I said marriage is kind of the bread and butter, but I do love the other questions too. If you have questions about exorcism or the other sacraments, feel free to call. But thank you so much for being here. I think this is so great, and these programs are so important. I think so many people are uncatechized, so you learning this and being able to help teach others is just a wonderful thing. And I know from doing the fall sessions, 2.5 hours every week is a long time, but thank you so much for doing it. So, thank you.